this way. Yeah, I guess overnight I started getting sick, and so I took a COVID test at home. It was positive, and it's definitely gotten worse pretty rapidly. But I'm okay to give a short lecture, so we'll do that, and we'll record it. I don't think that any of you were exposed from me because I didn't develop any symptoms till about when I went to bed last night, which were super mild. So I didn't see you that day. So my hope is that I'll be better by next Tuesday, and we'll be in class as normal next Tuesday. But I will update you, take a COVID test Monday afternoon, and post an announcement to Canvas specifying that. Okay. And so I've seen that I think one or two of you have started doing the journal. So that's great. I would like to remind you to do that. The journal is technically due next Tuesday, and it covers chapters 1 and 2. And that being said, given the state that I'm in, I doubt I'll grade it on Tuesday. So if you need a little bit longer, that's okay. But I would appreciate that you start it. The next chapter and next week's lectures is about historical aspects of urban geography. And some of that is like related to basic civilization history class. And I know at least for me, it's been a while. So some of you may be nerds on that, but not all of us. So read through that as best you can. I'll also post some links online that we'll watch hopefully in person. You can watch those a little bit ahead of time too if you want to help you. But I think just doing the journal will help you. And you can probably do the journal even if you don't yet have the book. I wrote the questions in a broad enough way that I think that's possible. Additionally, there's some links in week 1. So I've got this link to the NASA Worldview portal, which, check out. These links always don't pop up within Canvas. Sometimes you have to click on them to get them to work. Depends on what type of software and whether that integrates. But you can get access to a bunch of remote sensing data to just visualize and view real time and historical on your own. And so the one that's really relevant that we all looked at last class was this Earth at night composite image. And you can change that by time over here if you want. It's pretty cool. It's not always processed as beautifully as the image that I showed in class. That's because there's clouds and things, right? So you can see the most recent one in our neck of the woods looking a little fuzzy, probably because of snow flurries or something. But I just wanted to point that resource out for you in case you're interested in that type of GIS-related remote sensing data. So check that on your own. I've also linked to the census population clock. So this class is going to be a lot about population. This is US Census, but it also shows world population. So you probably know that there's over 8 billion people in the world now. And this is projected to, in your lifetimes exceed 10 billion people. So in terms of resource access, housing costs, I wouldn't expect that to go down anytime soon. US population's rising too, but you can see much less rapidly. And we'll talk about different types of population growth as we move through the semester. The other links that I have is definitions of an urban area as defined by the census. And we'll look at that briefly today in class in our lecture. But there's a video that I recommend that you watch, but you should do that on your own time. So these links are right here. That's the third link. And then if you're interested, there's 2 other links, which are, it's one of these kind of sort of AI generated videos that people make about the top US cities. This one is by population from 2017, and it's by city. There's another one here, top 15 over the last 100 years, and that's more by metro areas rather than individual cities. So we say Phoenix, that might mean Tempe, Mesa, Gilbert, etc. in that one. But they're a little loosey-goosey with how they follow those definitions, but I still think they're insightful. You can see how Rust Belt cities were all booming in post-World War II, and then went in rapid decline, and now the west and south cities are just rapidly rising up. And so, for instance, like Phoenix is top 5 city in the country now, which definitely was not the case if you went back to 1980, 1990 even. Wouldn't even been in the top 10. So yeah, look at that to think about some of the reasons behind it. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the PowerPoint unless anybody has any questions. If you have questions, raise your hand, I call on you, and we can chat as a group. All right, I don't see any questions, so we'll go to the PowerPoint. Okay, so I think this is where we ended last class. Like this full screen. You should be able to zoom in if you need to on the image, depending on how you're joining. If you're on your phone, you should be able to zoom. Okay, so we ended talking about the rural to urban continuum. Maybe some of you groaned because I was using a lot of northeastern U.S. examples, but we're going to talk about the Western U.S. They're really important examples as we move through the class, so don't worry, and other things around the world. One example, thinking about rural and urban spaces colliding. For winter break, I was in Los Angeles. So upper left, that's a picture showing the downtown skyline of Los Angeles. That's the second largest urban area in the US by metro area. Nearly 4 million people in the city itself, but depending on how you count it, there's at least 12 million in the Los Angeles metropolitan statistical area, defined by the census. But that also potentially includes the Riverside area, out more in what's called the Inland Empire, which has over 4 million people. So together, and if you include things like Orange County and some other neighboring areas, Los Angeles actually has over 18 million people today. But there are still aspects of what we'd call like little rural enclaves, and you guys are probably familiar with that, even here, much more so here in Utah Valley. But so in this image, we can see some park space, some maybe community farms on the side of this hill with terracing going on. And so some of these may be like defined parks at the municipal level. Others may be kind of homeowners association features, such as this basketball court, or perhaps this community supported agriculture or urban farm. Other areas might be just labeled as like open space that haven't been developed for some reason or another. Could be related to environmental pollution in the historical aspect, or maybe it's just not suitable to develop because of geologic factors like landslide risk or earthquake fault zones. And so we can see some of those near the freeway over here. There's probably landslide risk. But those still are utilized, especially by homeless populations and kind of maybe other people that are outside of kind of the typical framework that the city planning is thinking of. Also in the LA area, you're probably familiar, it's a big, if you go back in time, if you went here to 1860, say, there was a huge earthquake here in 1857, magnitude 8. 2,000 people lived in Los Angeles in 1860. So it was nothing like this. So you can imagine 18 million people it's gotten up to in about 150 years. Most of that growth is, post 1930 and 40. So really rapid. But there's still, vestiges of kind of what became the boom of this area. Some of it was the kind of climate. You can't really tell there, but it's a pretty place. There's 10,000-foot mountains, lots of national forest places adjacent to the city, just like here in Utah Valley. Within 5 miles of downtown, you can access some of these areas. It's much more polluted than Salt Lake is today. It's #1 polluted area in the country, but it's been improving. It's been improving for a number of factors. Environmental regulations, which California is leading on, although you wouldn't necessarily know it if you look at these diagrams. Moves to electrified cars, one of the first areas to remove diesel from general population and leaded gasoline. All these things have made an impact, and the total number of really polluted days is going down. And if we look through the urban area, there's other things like golf courses, which provide these nice enclaves. We can see a small municipal airport here, country clubs. These are kind of accessible to the upper class or upper middle class. But you can also see other things going on here, like solar farms, I believe, urban agriculture adjacent to the runway. And so crops are being grown here, probably on a commercial basis, and the farmers also tapping into the economy of electrification. And then oil is still a thing. So there's still active oil derricks here. And so think about LA, one of the biggest, most dense urban areas in the US, at least on the West Coast, still has pretty extractive rural aspects of things going on. So we asked the question a little bit last time, what is urban, what is rural, what is urban geography? And so we'll define that urban geography as kind of the interdisciplinary research of cities. And so many disciplines research cities. So we've got some diagrams over here on the left, right? The city is studied by anthropologists, historians, economics, political science, archaeology, sociology, probably number one, ecology, urban ecology. If we think about urban geography on the right, it's actually a field that is interdisciplinary. Of course, it's a geographic basis, and geography is inherently interdisciplinary. So it's drawing from all those fields that we just mentioned, and it's giving back, right? So as a geographer, you probably already feel somewhat interdisciplinary. You've been made to take physical geography classes, maybe some archaeology, history, etc. You need to kind of be able to speak to many different communities of disciplines. And so that brings us to some other things. Oh, we haven't quite got there yet. So in your book chapter, they have this diagram, which is a little bit complex to read maybe at first glance. The central one is what I'm talking about. So your book is divided into part 1, part 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And on either side, the left and the right, there's something that's called inter-metropolitan, and on the right, there's intra-metropolitan. So, and then on the top, there's regional sorts of analyses, and then on the bottom, there's topical sorts of analyses. And so we can classify different types of urban geography research in these kind of quadrants. So for instance, if we look over on the left, this study of the Northeast Boston to Washington area is showing long distance commutes and what cities they're tied to. So you can see most of these red dots are going to DC, but not all. Some of those orange ones are even going to New York, can you believe? There's this Boston-Wash corridor of daily trains that are really pretty fast. And so people make these immense commutes. Here's Boston. Yeah, Philadelphia, which actually has surprising amount of commutes. Interesting. But that is inter-metropolitan, so it's between cities, and it's a regional analysis of regional importance. And so it would fall up here in this quadrant, right? And then on the other hand, if we go to the intra-metropolitan region, so looking within a single city or single urban area, here we have the metropolitan. Oh, sorry, Wyatt, help us out. What's your internship called? It's Mountain Land Associations of Governments, is that right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so that's a Mountain Lands Association of Governments planning diagram. I don't know if it's the most up to date, but it shows a conceptual diagram of future transit ways in our valley. And this is a kind of planning entity, and they're trying to model commute times, how to minimize those and make the city work with time. And so that would be a study of a specific area and a regional analysis. So it would fall in the upper right quadrant. In the case down below it, we see the urban heat island effect, and that's generalizable, right? And so it's kind of a topical phenomenon. And we can look at it both for one city, or we could look at it trying to characterize how that works across all cities. And so in either case, you'd be in one of these quadrants. So for one city, intra-metropolitan, within that city, inter-metropolitan, between many cities. So hopefully that makes sense, and it kind of gives you a framework for how the different parts of the book are focused. So part 1, chapter 1 and 2 are at the nexus of all these. So it's trying to introduce everything. As we move to part 2, which will be our second journal, which includes chapter 3, and then also, I believe it's chapter like 13. So it's going to look at global north cities and global south cities. And so we're actually going to bridge between this quadrant and I think this quadrant up here in that next journal. But so that's the purpose of that diagram. Other things shown here is like the interconnectedness of cities globally via shipping lanes and the traffic density across these oceans. Okay, so any questions so far? Maybe I'll back up. Anything that you guys wanted to bring up in this diagram or anything before? Let's see some chat. Oh, interesting. Who's that? That is Nathan Jones asked us in 1850 or in 1857 is what I was really actually trying to quote. 2000 is about 2,700 people. Yeah, I bet it doesn't include indigenous populations. And it also was focused more on an intra-metropolitan focus, like right there in what was coined Los Angeles, as opposed to like, if we think about today, how broad LA is, there would have been more people and definitely more native peoples in the surrounding regions, especially associated with also colonialism and the missions that were throughout different parts of California, and even some forts that were still around, like Fort Tejon and other places, which had centroids of population, but not included in that estimate. The estimate, I believe, comes from a railroad survey of that city itself. Good question. So a few more people for sure than that, but maybe not a part of what the planning community was thinking about. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to move forward then. Okay, so how many, by show of hands, raise your hand right now, and I'll ask you to take it down in a second, have heard the term epistemology in other classes before, or other background readings that you've done on your own? Okay, so it looks like about 3 or 4. And now put your hands down. How many of you is this a completely new term, epistemology? Similar amount. Okay, good. So it's it's a term from philosophy, right? The study of knowledge, and it describes how different disciplines or approaches to building knowledge structure their what is valid as ways of knowing. So their methods that different disciplines use, uh, disciplinary research standards and practices, tools that they use. Um, Whatever's seen as a valid framework for building knowledge within that discipline. And so as a geologist, mapping is a big thing. Looking at rocks, it's actually a little different than maybe some other sciences, right? In geology, it's more observational without an experiment. You can design a natural experiment to like compare different areas of the earth, but you're looking at what the earth did and you're building a story. So in some ways, it's a little similar to history, right? And you can take your hands down if you don't have a question yet, but do leave them up if you do have a question. Carson, you have a question, it seems. Nope, I guess not. Okay, so yeah, as a geologist, I might inherently kind of see the validity of a historical perspective of making and constructing knowledge better uh, without doing a bunch of extra reading than maybe a physicist. Maybe. I'm not saying always, right? But it's because it's built into the framework of my discipline to build historical long time knowledge and then constructing it, one study on another, building that knowledge up. It's almost like reading the rocks instead of reading archives. But in geology, we're still a scientific approach. It would be described as positivism. Um, and so positivism is generally, you can think of it as a scientific framework. It can apply to social sciences and in fact, the term is probably developed out of more looking at social sciences than natural sciences. Um, but it's a scientific approach, a statistical, empirical approach to building knowledge, looking for and I'll describe what empirical means here in a minute more, relationships between variables and trying to make things more generalizable. And so you can think about GIS based spatial statistics. That would be positivism. Okay. But it doesn't mean that those types of analysis like GIS is only positivism. Okay. So then we have structuralism. So a structuralist would say that not everything can be fully compartmentalized into like a simple relationship between, maybe population and retail sales or something like that, or number of parks needed or something like that. It needs a wider perspective. It needs a more interdisciplinary understanding of more things outside of an individual city, thinking about maybe the political frameworks, the economic frameworks of like capitalism and how that shapes what is possible to build these empirical relationships, which might not be seen from just simply comparing the data. And so it does take a much more interdisciplinary approach. And so then humanism is more about lived experiences, feelings, perceptions, and ideas that matter most to people in understanding the city. So if you are a humanist or in court, you might not describe yourself as that, but I would describe some of the research that, for instance, Dr. Hungerford does, doing surveys and focus groups of how people deal with water in the city and things like that. This is a more humanism focused approach. Naturally, she's building on that more with some positivism data as well, and framing it within structuralism too. So it's very interdisciplinary, but it's bringing in that lived experience. That's what we call humanism. And then post-structuralism is a little bit trying to go beyond keeping it simple to any one of these things. So first thing of post-structuralism would be that truth cannot be always generalizable and knowable. So even system level thinking like structuralism can often be too simplistic. And then also post-structuralists might criticize that humanists are too disengaged to create a valid understanding. And so you could say, well, okay, so if we think about Dr. Hungerford's research, if you've taken a class with her, she does go beyond humanism to look at those other things as well in an interdisciplinary way. So maybe it's better to describe her as a post-structuralist, right? And that makes sense because if you look up these arrows over here, these diagrams are pointing to different kind of approaches that align with these epistemologies. And so if we look at post-structuralism, critical social theory, gender, feminist theory, postmodernism fall there and more recently. And so most people that are trained, especially from a social science perspective, are going to be kind of more integrative, what we'd call post-structuralists at this point in time. But if you look at me, or maybe a more physical science approach, student straight out of undergrad, they might have quite a bit more positivism embedded within what they do to create knowledge. Any questions on that? You can put your questions in the chat if you want. Sorry, you're having technical difficulties, Finn. I am recording it, and I will post it on Canvas shortly after the class. So you can always rewatch it. Okay, so up here in the upper right, there's this little cartoon, and two people are pointing at this. One of these, I think it's like oh, I'm forgetting the name of the artist. They had an exhibit at BYU Art Museum recently, but it's one of these optical illusions. Depending on your perspective, what you see there in terms of these rods is different, 3 or 4 blocks. And that means that if we think about these different disciplinary ways of getting at knowledge, we might be coming to different answers, and we're not necessarily wrong. And that's the whole point about post-structuralism, that truth is not always fully knowable by a one kind of disciplinary approach. Okay, so here to kind of elaborate on empiricism or empirical analyses. So on the upper left is a graph of life expectancy versus gross domestic product, GDP, per person. And the dots all represent data points by different countries. And this is called the Preston curve. I don't have the full reference here, but you could look that up. And so we can see that life expectancy generally goes up with greater wealth or gross domestic product, dollars generated by the economy of that country per person. This is in 2005. And so you can see that the curve has kind of a limit, right? It curves over, and that probably we're reaching some fundamental kind of cap on human life expectancy just based upon how biology works. Although some people say it's probably higher, like 110, 120 years. But anyways, some of these wealthy countries are reaching up quite high. An average person lives into their 80s. And US is one of those. We can see that on the right diagram, which is from 2018, and the curve is different. So the life expectancy curve on the left, you can see it's a logarithmic curve. And so this is what I mean by an empirical relationship. So this is a mathematically described curve for how life expectancy works as a function of income. And so it's a very simplistic way to think. You could plug in what's your GDP. If you can get your country's GDP up, then life expectancy should go up. That would be what the empirical relationship would say. But we see that there's a lot of width, right? At 1 GDP, you could range maybe 5, or in some places 10 years of life expectancy. It kind of flattens and narrows as we get to higher and higher values. But there's uncertainty in there. And so what that tells us is that it's not all about per capita income. It's other things like structures of how health systems are set up, pollution, things like that. And so this kind of shows that better. It's not arranged in the same type of curves, so it even looks more scattered because it's just a linear relationship. We can see a linear trend through there, but huge variability. And so like you can see the US is similar to Switzerland. Switzerland's a little bit richer than us on average. But the Swiss live almost 5 years longer than us with just I don't know, $8,000 more per year. And Japan, they have less money than us, but they live even longer than us. The circle size relates to uncertainty in the data from each country. And so you can see that China has a wider uncertainty. India also, because there's huge contrasts in the lived experience of those countries. If you go to these big cities in China, the standard of living in some of those urban areas is going to be way higher than most people living in the US. But on the other hand, if you get to the slums or the outskirts, it's going to be way lower. So there's a huge standard deviation there. Same with India and most of these developing countries. Although you can see in some areas like Afghanistan, it's a pretty small dot and it's not very high. And so there's other things playing in here: war, agricultural networks, and whether or not famines are going on, et cetera. And so this would say that we at least need to have a structuralist approach to understand life expectancy. But the reality is probably you need to go to a post-structuralist approach to really make action in terms of policy that's going to be the most effective. You need to be interdisciplinary. Yeah, and so some contrast. So just to see that, so this is in Mumbai, India. So you can see this part of Mumbai right here. It looks, I don't know, like Manhattan, right? These are some of the wealthiest, highest cost of living apartments that you can find in the world. You know, some of these people are hundreds of millions of heirs or billionaires. They own, in some cases, they own whole buildings. Um, Whereas these people here are living off, a GDP of, less than $8,000 per year, in some cases way down, right? Um, Less than $1,000 per year, and they're living right next to each other. So huge, huge contrast in these slums. You can see a lot of these homes are patched with, tarps and things to keep the rain out. But even within there, and we'll watch some videos on this later. This is a picture of a different slum in, I'm now forgetting which African city, so my bad. But it's a different structural kind of level, right? There's no pavement here. In some of these areas, it is paved. They do have some more advanced structures with rebar and things. But there's also still a lot of kind of ad hoc stuff going on. Super dense population in there. But there's whole economies built in there. And so, how can these really poor people live in this really wealthy city? They actually have their own economy going on, right? They have a whole different system under which they operate with. Their goods don't cost as much as these people out here. And so they're able to get by okay. Yeah. Okay, so when thinking about those different approaches, uh, positivism, structuralism, humanism, and post-structuralism, we can think about maybe less clumped ways to think about them and think about how uh, geographers study the city. So one thing right away is spatial analyses. And most of you have had GIS already, so you're familiar with this. But there's also some things that we'll talk about as we move through the book. One is central place theory, right? So this idea that a city is likely to follow this kind of spatial pattern to minimize transportation and labor costs. And so you'll have kind of these radial ring networks of city expansion. And they could be tied to some of these historical centers that we see as we read through chapter 2. And so these are very generalizable statistical relationship models. And so this is very simplistic in some ways. They do inform us a lot about how cities work, but they definitely don't describe everything. And spatial analyses, well, this is how they started, even before GIS. These sort of things were theorized on well before geographic information systems came out in the 1960s and 70s. Behavioral urban geography. So this can also be a spatial analysis approach. So spatial analysis is valid, but it says that previous work on these basic theories was too broad. Instead, spatial analysis should incorporate how individuals and groups make decisions. And so one thing that you might have heard of is something like agent-based modeling. And so you might go to a sociologist and they know, maybe they have disciplinary theories about how people make decisions given different frameworks, income levels, family sizes. And then you could build like a simulation of how a city would work. Okay, if you changed how healthcare is delivered to the city, how would things progress, right? So this would be this agent-based modeling. So you can kind of tell how individuals will react based upon sociological research and then model how the whole system might change. So that's pretty cool. And we've had a couple of examples of people that do that. I remember a really cool seminar from somebody at Utah State University a few years back, probably before you guys were at UVU. But it's an active area of geographic research, one you might be interested in. Marxist urban geography or political economy would say that spatial approach is just too limited. We also need to think about things that aren't shown in kind of spatial analyses necessarily. So they're hidden in political documents and kind of economic structures. So larger power structures should also be a focus of understanding issues of the city, especially things like how poverty, health, labor relationships, and other kind of injustices evolve. And so you can see this diagram, I believe it's a Marx diagram, and it's showing, consumption, labor, transfers of funds. And the argument here is that this is how you're really going to understand the city. Now, that being said, I would say that that is totally valid. We should definitely include that in our analyses of city. It's ultra important. But there's still a spatial side of it. And so over on the left, we see some of the projects early on in Chicago, Illinois. They look pretty nice and pristine here, and I don't remember what year this is. But on the left, also you see that other map of color, red and yellow. So this is areas that were redlined. Basically, the powers that be actually did use a spatial approach to say where people of color or poor people should be allowed to get home loans. And so this is inherently spatial injustice built in from this kind of Marxist framework by people and more by organizations, racist organizations in this case. And so then critical social theory would be framed work, kind of more modern. And the idea is that the research should be dedicated to changing the world for the better. So it is definitely a leftist approach, although you'd probably find many people that wouldn't go describe themselves as leftists that also would claim that research should be for the good of society. So I think most people would say that. Research to uncover power dynamics that might be holding back aspects of society. And so that research definitely is spatial. It's definitely Marxist or structural. And we need to include all of those things. And so it's more holistic. And then feminist urban geography. So basically, this part of urban geography started in a fairly simplistic way, but now is quite advanced and actually is leading a lot of the kind of push forward for how to be interdisciplinary about thinking about cities and other fields as well. So at first it was like really simplistic things like how does gender and patriarchal power structures influence the lived experience of people in cities, women, men, etc., or potentially just different classes of society. But today it's much more what we call intersectional. And so it's not just focused on gender or one sort of power class. It's trying to look at all of the things that go into the lived experience of people. I'm sure, I mean, we have like only one woman in the class. We have 10 men. I doubt that all 10 of us or 11 of us see ourselves as having the same framework of what influences our lives in the city or in life just based upon our gender. It's many other things, right? I grew up in a rural community. I am visibly a different color. Things like that could play a role. And so it's trying to keep things less simplistic and look basically much more post-structuralist approach. And so it's kind of the forefront of things. Nathan.
Yeah, can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I read a book that I think there was like a study done in Sweden where they changed how they shoveled their snow, changed it from prioritizing like roadways to shoveling sidewalks first, and that like reduced by more than 50% the number of people who got injured in accidents where they were, well, just accidents in the winter because people were a lot more likely to slip and fall than actually crash in their cars. But that also, because women are so much more likely to walk compared to men in the world, that was like a way that they provided more equality just by changing the way that like snow was removed, as an example.
Yeah, quite interesting. Does anybody else want to have something to add? I like that example. How's it done here? Who shovels the snow here?
I don't know how it's done here. I know that, well, I think that UDOT does it here and prioritizes roadways, and then just like people who live around, like I don't know how it actually works in the city.
Yeah,
Like
I
in
think
suburbans, people should
yeah.
have their own.
So yeah, you're right. The major streets are done by UDOT. Cities probably do their own kind of main grid as well as kind of the side neighborhoods, although they don't do it to the level that you might see in some places like the New Northeast where I grew up. And then sidewalks are really outside of the main streets are actually this responsibility of the homeowner. Um, but I see what happens a lot is actually it's very kind of organization. Well, so like the church, for instance, I in my neighborhood, some people have these little ATVs and they got a plow on it, and they just go and do everybody's basically. But nobody's paying taxes towards that, which is interesting, right? It's a totally different structure, and it means it's highly variable from one neighborhood to the next of how it works and the outcomes there. Anything else? I like discussion, so obviously it's easier in class, but please add it on. I hope this is helpful. You've probably thought about these things before. The last part of this lecture, we'll finish up here pretty shortly, is thinking about how the US structures how we measure what's going on in cities. So the official census spatial units of the United States. So if you're in a GIS class, you'll probably get into some of this when you start to do some more social science spatial analysis. But the smallest unit is like city blocks, right? And so you can imagine that in most areas of a city, at least, it's kind of like from, the area defined by streets, like within an area where there's no streets in between, a square. So it's a small group of homes, like a block in my neighborhood probably has about, I don't know, 20 homes or so. Um, and so so they collect data at that level, the census does. That's the survey level. But they don't distribute that level of data to people such as you and me. They distribute it at a block group level, so it's the smallest unit for detailed data distribution. And the amount of people within a block group is variable. Um, I think it's on average about 2,000 people in a block group. So it's somewhat anonymized. And so therefore, that is the detailed data level that you can get. It's anonymous enough that you can't figure out, in most cases, who's the outlier that is skewing wealth in that neighborhood so high or something like that. Or on the other hand, they collect things like single parent head of household. You can't figure out, oh, who's that, right, in that neighborhood that's not married, right? So it protects people's personal information. But in the end, it's variable in terms of population lying within there. These things, block groups and block groups shift. So since they're trying to target about that 2,600 to 3,000 people, as a city densifies, the block group might get smaller and things like that. So that unit of analysis is not necessarily the same at every decadal census, like every 10 years. It might, those shapefiles or feature classes will be perhaps a different shape if the city's grown or lost population. And then tracks. So tracks are aggregates of block groups. So we can see that here. And so these are small. They're designed to be permanent and consist of about 1,200 to 8,000 people. Of course, the size is going to vary by population density. So if you're in a rural area, your tracks are going to get way bigger. Yeah. And then counties we're all familiar with. So within a county, there's some number of tracks, and states are above counties. Those are actual entities of governance, right? But these other things are kind of sub-city level, and the tracks could even cross over cities potentially. And these things, tracks and block groups, are used for redistricting processes in voting. And so you might find that one election to the next, where you go to vote changes. Although in Utah now it's all vote by mail, so that problem becomes less important. But that's because, basically the powers that be, whoever's in charge, change the districts to try to equilibrate the population across the districts. We'll get into that later in this class, but that is a power structure thing too, because tends to be that if it's Republican dominated or if it's Democrat dominated legislature, you get a lot of biases in these districts, and they structure it. This is called modified aerial. Oh my goodness, MUA. Sorry, is the acronym. Basically, you can get what voting outcomes you want with GIS, and so they hire people to basically make it so that nobody from the other party can be elected in that state, even though things aren't always dichotomous as you think in most states. Like even in Utah, it's like really 60% Republican, but you'll never have Democratic representation almost. And same thing in the East Coast, in Northeast, you're always going to get Democratic representation, even though 45% of Republicans may be there. And so it's not good for representation. But it happens, and you've probably seen battles about what's called gerrymandering in the news, and this is going with these redistricting of changes of these data units with time. And then for cities, the census aggregates these, I think it's county level, into what are called metropolitan statistical areas. And that means that they have one of those counties, or a county with more than 50,000 people would be described as a metropolitan statistical area. And then the size of that metropolitan statistical area could be expanded if there's an adjacent area that's also large. And so an example might be up here in northern Vermont. I think I'm saying this right. So these two counties are together, and no, they actually are two different named metropolitan statistical areas. So take that back. So I think metropolitan statistical areas are counties greater than 50,000 people, whereas there's this other set, which is micropolitan statistical areas, 10 to 50,000 people in that area. And so if there's a county that has more than 10,000 people, it would classify as what's called micropolitan statistical area. And the adjacent counties could join in potentially as well, and so they could grow. And so you get some kind of larger polygons. Watch the video on this because I could be saying that wrong. I'll correct myself if I did in class. But so as a result, there's 392 what are described as metropolitan statistical areas in the US, areas with more than 50,000 people. And so you can see Salt Lake City. Yeah, actually I'm right, because you can see that includes Salt Lake County and some of these rural areas. And Provo-Orem includes some of these rural areas as well. So there are combinations. But they are kind of defined by counties. They get pretty big. And that means that within these statistical areas of analysis, there are definitely lots of rural entities as well. So keep that in mind. A lot of the data is aggregated by these metropolitan or micropolitan statistical areas. So when we look at that or download that data, if you want to do a historical analysis of a particular urban area, it can be including a lot of rural entities as well. Yes, it reminds me of the board game Settlers of Catan. I got to play that this summer with some students in my field geology class. I agree. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture for today. I went 5 minutes over what I thought I would. Do you guys have any questions? Want to follow up on? I don't see any questions coming up. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording, and it'll download